Welcome to episode 5 of the Main Event podcast, our first episode of 2025. And today I'm really excited to sit down with the very intelligent and well educated coach of athletes, as I would call you, Orlaith White. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much for having me on, Adam. I'm a fan of your podcast, so thank you. It's a privilege.
I appreciate it. And for those watching who maybe haven't seen your work before, you've described your role as the following: I coach, educate, and empower athletes to reach their maximal potential. Why is that the best way to describe you?
Yeah, I think coaching in general is hard to define. I think for me, it's your personal style, but coaching is something that's very individual and quite unique. And I think from coaching in the last 6 or 7 years, I probably found my own methods or own way. So I think the empowerment element for me is something that's super important in terms of I'm actually nearly trying to put myself out of a job when I start working with athletes because I want them to feel like they can be self-sufficient and they can be educated enough to do the things that they need to do in order to find their peak performance or try to be educated with, say, their nutrition or their sleep or whatever aspects of performance that will help them from a performance side of things, but also just from a well-being, a happiness, a health point of view. I really try to merge the two. And a lot of the time, they're very contradictory. Health and performance don't necessarily go together a lot of the time. But for me, going from physical performance and now entering into more of the world of maybe psychology, sports psychology, I'm trying to find the balance between both. But empowerment for me and trying to, again, look at the athletes for who they are and for what they need specifically is something that I'm quite passionate about. And again, trying to put myself out of a job to ensure that they can be as self-sufficient as possible.
Yeah, on a previous podcast, your coaching style was described as human first, athlete second, which is a really individual outlook on coaching and something that I think is probably quite lacking, especially with coaches of teams where they have a group of athletes to be dealing with. Why do you feel that's the best approach for coaching?
Yeah, I think whether you're working with an individual athlete or whether you're working in a team, I think everyone's personality is very different. Everyone's previous training experience is very different. Their motivation, their goals, why they're there. So you kind of have to meet the athlete at where they're at that moment of time, and you can't really have a one size fits all. And I think if you just look at the academic or the athletic development of the athlete coming in, it's only part of the story. So whether they have a really high training age, they've trained for years, or whether they're brand new into the gym, that's only one side of the story. For me, I try to really look at the human for who they are, what their background has been, even simple introduction questions like, where are you in your family tree? Like, are you the middle sibling? Are you the eldest? Are you the youngest? What's your family life like? Where do you live? Where did you grow up? Like those kind of things. Do you play any other sports? And you kind of get even a sense of the individual from their body language, how they speak about themselves, how they speak about others. So I think you generally have to look at the human before you even try to attempt to improve their performance. And then once you have that, or you get a good judge of them, you can really start to look at athletic performance then. But for me, I really try to merge them both. And I think if you just looked at the athletic side of things initially, you probably wouldn't get the most benefits from that approach.
When you talk about coaching the individual first and the athlete second, it sounds like there's quite a lot of psychological work on that. You mentioned well-being. What methods have you found quite beneficial for working with people on that basis of individual before athlete?
Yeah, I think I'm studying a master's in sports psychology at the moment, so I'm very much a student, and I'm learning from incredible practitioners, my lecturers that are within the college, and guest speakers and people that I'm meeting within the industry as well have been brilliant. So there are a lot of practical tools, and evidence-based tools that you can use, like personality testing tools like Spotlight, or social cohesion within teams, and kind of workshops around breaking down barriers and trying to improve both task cohesion and social cohesion within teams. But for me, again, I'm very much a student of that at the moment. I'm halfway through, not even actually, I'm probably about a third of the way through my master's at the moment. But traditionally, I've just looked at communication as the biggest tool, and I think how you do that is very different to who's in front of you. You can get generic, say, working with team sports, especially in Shamrock Rovers, the team that I'm with at the moment, they fill in a form before every training session, and it's really good practically. So they have to put in their training load if they've done anything outside of Rovers that week. We look at what week of their cycle they're on, if they're experiencing any PMS, if they have any niggles. But there's also some questions around how are you feeling today? Are you emotionally strong for training today and going on that we can help you with? So I think just trying to develop that professional alliance with the athlete is super important. And I think communication for where I'm at the moment is probably just the biggest tool, and trying to have those one-to-one chats, trying to make them feel like they're in a safe environment as well. And confidentiality is one thing that would be quite important for me, in ensuring that they're able to be fully expressive in an environment where they know they're giving this information and I have the best intentions of trying to help them with their performance or with trying to get their best version out onto the pitch. So yeah, there are a huge amount of tools that I'm learning to use. But what I've traditionally used has just been communication, logging forms, and trying to get to know them.
I want to come back to all the detail that you use to kind of get to know your athletes, but first things first. So most coaches come from an athletic background first, like myself included. So I presume that's no different with you. Just talk to me about how you went from perhaps an athlete to a coach and why you progressed that way.
Yeah, I think when I was younger, probably similar to you, Adam, like did probably every sport under the sun and was thrown in by my parents. I actually played with my brothers and younger brothers' football team, trained with them for a while, because football in around Naas, where we live, wasn't massive. Like, you probably had to travel to Dublin. So played Gaelic football, got into soccer more so when I was a teenager, which is very late. You don't really get the youth training that's necessary now if you're going into big clubs like Shamrock Rovers. But I played just locally, and then I got into, I wanted to try and get into the League of Ireland. So, and I actually kind of wanted to do it, one, to just prove to myself that it was a really good challenge to try and do it. But two, I was working with athletes who were playing in the league, and I kind of felt like I could absolutely empathize with their situation and what they were going through, if they had struggles or highs or lows. But I really felt like I needed to try and do it and experience it in order to help them maybe a little bit more. So I eventually was trialing with that lone town. I got in with them for a season, and it was an incredibly challenging and really empowering season as well. And I definitely grew so much and got to play in the League of Ireland, which was excellent. But all throughout that year, I was very much like, yeah, this isn't for me. Like, I don't want to be a pro footballer or an elite level.
The lifestyle too intense, or what was it that put you off?
Yeah, I think it was just more enjoyment, to be honest. Like, I think traditionally I'd use sport as my social time, like in my time to go out and play with people that I really enjoyed and to be competitive and to compete. And I wanted to win for sure. But there was also an element of like, I didn't really feel much pressure kind of playing underage, or whereas when you go into a top side and you're playing in the top league in Ireland, there's definitely a huge amount of pressure. And for me personally, it just wasn't aligned with enjoyment, and that's kind of what I wanted from it, really. So, and also I just really, really enjoyed coaching, and I really knew that that was kind of my path and where I wanted to go, and also where I felt like I could have the biggest impact, because I absolutely wasn't the best footballer. I was stubborn and fit and controlled what I could, and I was grateful to have minutes in the league as well. But for me, I knew it wasn't going to be something that was a natural talent, and I just worked hard at it. So yeah, transitioning from there, it was coming into coaching. I was working here obviously in Unit 3, and when I left college I was just working in like a hotel gym. And although you're working with kind of general population clients and maybe the odd athlete or two, I wouldn't actually classify that as coaching at all. I feel like I only probably became a coach when I probably started here in Unit 3 and actually really learned about coaching and the platform that you can have and the impact that you can have as well, and the route to actually getting there as well, like, so, and the different elements of coaching that can have a big impact on the athletes. So yeah, I think I naturally just fell into here, Unit 3, and then progressed my way through. Obviously Unit 3 is an incredible community-based gym, and I think actually within the industry, our industry as well, there's the health and fitness industry, but I feel like there's so many little micro industries within that as well, and they're actually not really comparable, like commercial or hotel gyms to community or high performance gyms. I feel like they're just completely separate. So again, yeah, coaching here and then working my way through. Obviously there's a huge amount of boxers here, which was excellent to get exposure to training with them, and then myself and Evan, my brother, a coach who works here as well, brought in a lot of footballers. So I think then I always say to when I'm going into clubs or when I'm chatting to everyone, we're so lucky to be full-time coaches, because in the League of Ireland especially, there's so many people that work day jobs or go to college and then they coach at nighttime, or if they're an athlete, they come and train at nighttime. But for me and Ev, we're so blessed to actually be full-time coaches, whether we're working with general population clients or high-performing athletes. Like it's a real privilege to do, and it's something that I feel like it has always been, without being real cringy, kind of like a purpose. Like, and it's something that's always been pushing me forward into pursuing a little bit more. And it's now why I'm taking the step further into education and pursuing a master's in sport and exercise psychology.
And you mentioned that you felt personally you weren't the best footballer. There's an analogy that I quite like sometimes, that sometimes the better, more gifted athlete may struggle to relate to athletes they're coaching at another stage, because they just had gifts, they had techniques and skills kind of nailed down quite quickly because they're so naturally athletic. Do you feel there's something behind that, in terms of the fact that you felt you weren't possibly the best footballer makes it easier to relate to these athletes, in terms of you understand the struggles they're going through when they're learning the skills and they're doing their strength and conditioning training? You can relate to it a bit more, as opposed to if you were just really naturally gifted.
100%. Yeah, there's a really mad stat around footballers that were exceptional when they were younger, and they were well ahead when they were kind of under 8s, 9s, 10s, 11s, coming up the ranks, and they were well ahead of their peers in terms of maybe technical development or tactical developments. But then when they get to maybe higher underage or senior level, they kind of fall off. Like, and a lot of that is due to the fact that they haven't gone through the hardship to be able to compete when they're kind of at level with their peers. And then secondly to that, I feel like if you haven't had those experiences when you're younger, maybe there's resilience elements to it that aren't impacted, or maybe they've been really praised for talent over work ethic. And so it's, yeah, for sure, I think if you've been through hardship or struggles or just general challenges that have been really, really difficult with football, I think especially, I knew going into the League of Ireland that I definitely wasn't the most technical player or tactically aware, but I knew I could be the fittest. So I was like, right, well, I'll just try and do that, like, or I'll try and be maybe a bit more of a leader, or I'll try and impart my knowledge of strength and conditioning to the team because that will help the team, or I'll try and do whatever I can to control the controllables essentially. So I think if you do have it, it's very difficult at the time, because if you want to be playing or you want to be given kind of a good crack at it, it's you want it to be easy, but on reflection, the more hardship you go through within a certain extent, and ensuring that you have support systems and the ability to cope, it's much better. It's much more beneficial, and I'm very grateful for that experience that I was playing for the year, because it was incredibly challenging and incredibly rewarding, and it made me a much better coach for the athletes that I'm with. And I also kind of think, to some degree, it kind of gives a bit more weight to your words, because you've been there and you've done that. And even though it was just a season and I'd be nowhere at the level of the athletes that I'm coaching now, you kind of have been there in some capacity. So it gives a little bit more weight, I think, to your words.
I personally feel like coaches who decide that they want to work, especially with athletes, you can tell me if you think I'm wrong here, by the way, do so mainly for two reasons. So one being that as an athlete themselves, when they're younger, they feel like they didn't get the level of coaching that maybe they deserved, or that other people were getting, or that it wasn't good enough. They may have looked around and, kind of an entrepreneurial mindset and said, I can do this better, I can help people better. Or else it's the other side of the coin, where they were so well coached, or they had such exposure to elite level coaches, that they kind of want to provide that for other people, and they want to be able to spread that around. Do you feel you fall into either of those categories, or is it a little bit of both?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think probably the first one. I think for me, even touching on, there was no soccer team around me. I had to travel to Dublin if I wanted to play. So, yeah, I think traditionally I'm nearly 30 in a few days, big birthday. But for me, when I was younger, there definitely was no access to gym. Strength and conditioning wasn't even a thing. The coaches were your mum or your dad, and you were kind of fighting for even pitches as a female, like in sport. That's my experience. So, yeah, I didn't really just notice this until maybe a year or two into coaching, and someone said to me, like, yeah, you're just trying to be the coach that you needed when you were younger. And I was like, Jesus, I actually think I am, like. And I think that's a great driving force, and offers great motivation to try and give you your why as to why you're trying to help these athletes. I have been subjected to incredible coaching kind of later into my teenage years, and I'm surrounded by amazing coaches here and in Shamrock Rovers. But yeah, when I was younger, it was definitely, I'm looking back to younger Orla and going, Jesus, I would have loved me like when I was younger. So I think you're right, for sure. I'm definitely trying to to impart knowledge that I didn't get when I was younger.
You obviously now specialize in coaching athletes, but like most coaches, I presume it didn't start that way. Like you said, you worked in more commercial gyms and worked with, quote unquote, general population, your lifestyle clients. What are the main differences you feel you found in coaching your general lifestyle clients and your obviously elite level athletes, even compared to people who are general lifestyle but are really interested in their training and they're really dedicated, but then you have your athletes that are trying to make it their career and make it their livelihood going forward? What's the main differences you found so far?
Yeah, I think there's for sure differences. There's also a lot of similarities as well. I think there's a myth around athletes that so many people have said to me, oh Jesus, you're working with really high performing athletes, they must be a nightmare, like, or they must be so hard to coach or so demanding. Yeah, but I actually find elite athletes, like pro athletes, everyone I work with in Shamrock Rovers, all the athletes that I have here are such winners that they just are so easy to work with, like, and they want any potential marginal gain that's going to help their performance, so they will do absolutely anything to get there. So in terms of wanting to be more educated, trying different methods, pushing themselves in training, they're actually really easy to deal with, in my opinion, whereas I think the myth is the opposite, like they're divas, which they aren't. But I think the biggest difference is probably just the goals. Like, I think with general population clients, a lot of the goals are probably based around maybe longevity, health, wellness, even functionality, like being able to carry their shopping in from the car or being able to get up if they fall, or just having better health, better quality of life. And that's very health orientated. I think for athletes, I'm trying to impart the health aspect of that, and I don't believe that well-being has to suffer in order for performance to peak. But I think that athletes in general wants to perform so badly that they will do anything to get there. So I feel for sure that that's probably the biggest difference between coaching them both, that maybe sometimes my job is actually pulling athletes back a little bit, like, whereas maybe for general population it's pushing them on a bit more. So probably just the goals are the biggest difference. But in terms of training, like, the foundations of strength and conditioning are pretty much the same. You might of course tweak a little bit or progress a little bit for high performing athletes, especially if they're used to gym settings and have a lot of years of training. But similarities for me are, there's a huge amount of them as well.
Do you find it difficult to balance between the two? Like, obviously you still do a little bit of work with your general population, but obviously more focused towards athletes. Do you find that difficult? Like, it's a switch you have to turn on and off?
Not really. And it probably should be. I think that I can be quite present, I think, and where I'm at is where I'm at. And if I'm in maybe because it's separate as well, maybe if I had all of my athletes under the one roof here, it might be a bit different to go, okay, 9 o'clock you're with the athletes, 10 o'clock you're with Gen Pop, and you're kind of going back and forth for the day. But for me, they're very separate. So when I'm here, of course, I have a couple of individual athletes that I work with. But for the most part, when I'm in Unit 3, I'm working with general population clients, and when I'm in Rovers, I'm working with high performing athletes. So I actually have a physical switch by changing my environment. So I don't feel like there's a massive difference even in my personality or how I act. I suppose, like, I'm professional in both environments, and maybe when you're talking to athletes who are similar to your age, or there's maybe a bit more crack, like with the high performing athletes, and then there's a switch for when they're doing their work. So, but I think I'm probably quite similar in how I deliver the sessions just might be tweaked based on who's in front of me, but I don't really find it difficult, no.
You mentioned now you're working with Rovers women's team, which from the outside looking in just looks like your dream job, like looks like your real happy place. How did that role come about, and how have you found the whole process since you've got in?
Yeah, I adore the role in Shamrock Rovers. It's an excellent club, and I can't speak highly enough about it and about the staff that are there. And the players, and the top people, even the CEO is exceptional as well, and he's been very helpful to me personally, trying to progress with my career and also just progress the women's section of the club as well. So yeah, the role came about. So it was kind of a unique position where Shamrock Rovers didn't actually have a women's team a couple of years ago, a senior women's team. They had developed the underage setup. So when they were setting up the first team for the women, there was kind of talk about the league, and I was working with another team at the time, DLR Waves, at an underage level, and I was just like, I'm getting in there. Like, I don't know how this is going to work, but I want to be in there, because you're establishing a culture That's already there with the men's team and with the underage setup, but you're establishing your version of it for the senior women's team. And that was just so appealing to me, to be able to have an impact on the actual ways that we were going to do this, like, and to develop really high standards, really important systems that were aligning with the exceptional levels that are already existing within the club. So yeah, it actually happens through how everything happens in this industry, through knowing someone. So my mum, would you believe it or not, at the time, she still is, she's the child welfare officer in the club. So she just met the director of football that was there, and he was just asking about, he knew about me and that I'd been working in the league and working with players, and he just said, would I come in and have a chat with him and stuff, and it just kind of took off from there. So yeah, that was a couple of years ago, going into our third season now, and again, I can't speak highly enough of the club and everything they've done for me, and I've really, really enjoyed every moment there.
I want to talk about training females specifically for a moment. So as a male coach, I've really tried so hard and put a lot of hours into trying to educate myself on the physiological differences between coaching a male and a female, because as a male, I can speak from a male's perspective. I know what it feels like to train as a man, eat as a man, recover as a man. I can speak from that perspective. I can't speak from the perspective of a female, whether it be an athlete or a general population. So I've really spent a lot of time trying to educate myself on the physiological differences. We spoke before the episode, obviously, about the Q angle, even the different center of gravities that men have compared to women. But the most obvious one, I think, is the menstrual cycle. And it's something that I'd find really interesting. Is there adjustments you make with your athletes based on what phase they are around their cycle? How do you go around coaching? Because these high performance athletes, this is their life, and they have this core difference that, you know, the male athlete doesn't have to deal with. Is there kind of protocols you have in there to help yourself coach these people?
Yeah, so I know I'm studying a master's, but I'm not an academic. I'm more of a practitioner. So for me, it's super important to have an evidence-based approach and to be up to date on the research that's there. And I'd go to regular conferences or reach out to industry experts that are PhD, have done their PhD or are studying the female athletes. So a couple of years ago, there was actually research, and actually in general, the research that's on females in sports and the female athlete is very, very limited, but it is getting much better. So of the research that was out a couple of years ago, they were basically saying to adapt the training based on the week of the cycle that the female was on. But more recently, the research is actually going against that, and it's saying that the menstrual cycle doesn't actually have a big impact on performance, or enough of an impact on performance to fully adapt your training around it. So for me, I would take the evidence-based approach for sure, and I'd also look at the practicalities of that too, because that might be 100% true, but if someone wakes up in the morning and has really bad symptoms, they have really bad stomach cramps, a migraine, they haven't slept the night before, the thought of food is making them sick, I believe it probably will affect their performance. So for me, I take the evidence that's there and I employ it in a general standpoint, and then I take the individual approach of looking at all the athletes. I use the forms an awful lot as well that the players would fill in each day before training, and one of them is, are you experiencing any symptoms today? What week of your cycle are you on? Just so I can keep an eye on it as well. And one of the reasons around that too is that so there, it doesn't disappear, because if someone is overtraining, especially as a female, if your period disappears for a month or two, it's not a good sign. It's generally that they're under fueling and they need a bit of support. So I asked them to put the weeks in just for that. And then talking around symptoms, it just gives me a good idea coming into the session if someone is struggling, someone's a little bit fatigued, they haven't slept well, they've quite bad stomach cramps or whatever it is. So yeah, there's a lot around the menstrual cycle, there's a lot around ACLs as well. You mentioned the Q angle, and again, there is research that's coming. A lot of the clubs in England as well, I know Arsenal had an awful lot of ACL injuries, so they've actually invested money into trying to figure out why that's happening, like, and the Q angle is a reason, football boots, the pitches, the quality of the pitches, the load of the players, lack of strength and conditioning or lack of training age. So there's so many factors. It's hard to really like narrow in on one of them, but all you can do is educate yourself on the research that's out at the moment. The research as well is so new and it will be constantly changing, so it's super important to just stay up to date with that. True, again, I'm not an academic, I'm not the one that's doing this research, but especially in strength and conditioning, but looking at the likes of even Dr. David Nolan, I went to a conference with him last year. He was really educational around not adapting the training based on the menstrual cycle. I went to the All Ireland conference a couple of weeks ago as well, where they released MEDA, which is a new a new program that's going to help female athletes in the island of Ireland as well. So it's just staying up to date with these things, taking an educated guess, but then also having your feet on the ground and seeing what's in front of you. And if someone is not taking it as set, if you know what I mean. So if someone actually is really struggling with symptoms, it's about how you can try and help them, link in with the medical team that's there as well, and try to make the best decision with the evidence that you have.
And then step back to, so if you're going to look at coaching the individual more so than the athlete, do you find it's something that maybe is difficult or time consuming to, everyone reacts differently. Every individual is an individual. They react differently to different scenarios, whether it be their cycle, recovery, whatever training you're bringing them through. Do you find it a little bit challenging to, especially working with the team or a big group of athletes, to go one-to-one with each person and figure out, try and understand what's going on in their life, how they're dealing with things, how they're recovering? Is that something you find time consuming, challenging, draining?
Yeah, it's definitely time is the only thing. We are the first club with Shamrock Rovers to have a professional contracts for the players, but we aren't full time. So we are there 3 nights a week and we have the game the weekend. So we don't physically have the time to sit down like this and talk to each player for 20 minutes each session. So it is just about trying to control what you can, and the forms are a huge part of that. So it's basically a virtual check-in with all of them, and then if any flags arise in it, I'll just have a quick word with them in the gym and see what's going on and see if they need a bit of support as well. But yeah, it is, time is the only thing. It's just, that's literally, it's just trying to get a hold of all of them at the same time. And but yeah.
You mentioned the Q angle before, or I brought it up, and you mentioned it there. I just want to touch on it in a little bit more detail. So for those watching, my simplest, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but my simplest understanding of it is it's the angle created from your quadriceps to your patella tendon, so like your knee basically. And obviously physiologically women will have a larger Q angle than males because of the wider hips that they have naturally. And it seemed to have some sort of link to a higher amount of ACL injuries, whether it's the way force is distributed down through their leg, on landings. And you mentioned football boots. You said Arsenal are putting a little bit more research into it for their players. Can you just talk to me a little bit about that? And is there anything you do or you think that can be done to combat it apart from more research?
Yeah, I think that's the nail on the head. Like, it is, more research is needed, but it is being funded now, and there's such a gap there for researchers to try and explore it, that I think a lot of people are in Ireland and abroad as well, which is excellent to see. I think the Q angle is definitely something that is reoccurring within the research that is there, and it makes a lot of sense as well if you think of the wider hips, and then even landing mechanics and stuff will be affected, even the type of football boots as well. So yeah, for sure, I think there's just more research needed. Like, you can take the best guess that you can based on the evidence that's there, but it's trying to stay up to date with the research that's coming, and it is coming, which is excellent. So for me, what I do is I just follow the protocols that are there. FIFA have a warm-up protocol, strength training is a positive as well, so we just do that religiously as well. I'd focus on we do a good bit of testing as well at the start of the season, so we do kind of single leg jump testing, sometimes single leg Nordic. We even go with the in-body scanner that will give you the difference in skeletal muscle mass in each leg as well. And then we'll try to give corrective gains to the athletes, that one side isn't completely overloaded with the other. And with football, you obviously have a dominant leg, so it's quite, the variances can be quite high in football for the most part. So that's one thing that we do. But I think just the basics of strength training, fueling the body, try not to overload the players. We use Stat Sports as well, so which is a GPS metric. So we track all training sessions, live tracking, and then we track all games as well and look at the data after. So it's a really hard balance, because you're trying to get them ready for the season or get them ready to perform each weekend and not tip the scale. Do you know what I mean? So you kind of have to go to it, and sometimes you go over, but for the most part, the basic principles of just strength training, fueling well, making sure they're sleeping well, making sure they're in a good position to get out onto the pitch, and then adapting the training slightly around it is what I've taken. And then just keeping your eye on the research and seeing what's coming down the line, and what the suggested protocols are.
Statistically speaking, from the ages of 12 to 18, which are obviously the puberty years, it seems that there's more than double a number of females that walk away from sport than males. Why do you think that is?
I think it's multifaceted. I don't think there's one specific theme that girls just drop out of sport. I think there's so many reasons for it, even probably dependent on the sport as well. I think maybe for me, I did my undergrad thesis in factors influencing why girls drop out of sport from that age, and a huge part of it was simple things that you actually wouldn't even think of, like, and this has changed a good bit now, but access to toilets was a massive thing, like, and
Really?
even myself, like as a player playing Gaelic or playing soccer when I was 13, 14, 15, I'd show up to so many games and be no bathrooms. Like, and if you are there for 4 or 5 hours and you have your period, you're just up the walls. Like, so that was a massive one for girls dropping out. White shorts as well. A lot of girls are saying like they'd wear double underwear, like, or to have double protection, or wear Under Armour shorts because they'd be so fearful. Like, and the psychological stress of that, just even in regards to performance, is going to have a big impact as well. Social side of it too, if they weren't very socially connected to the team, they were more than likely to drop out also. Coaching styles, also maybe pitch availability, those kind of things. So I think it's multifaceted for sure. I think there's a natural dropout, maybe it's just interest when you're going through your teenage years, you're going through finding your identity as well, and maybe it's just different. You might go into music, or you might go into poetry, or go into something completely different as well. So it's for sure multifaceted, but there is a good amount of research on it now, which is great. And I think there's a lot more access. Like, the accessibility is a lot bigger now. I think speaking for football too, there's a lot more of an awareness around the factors that definitely influence the dropout rate. And there's programs put in place, and they're simple things like just access to toilets, having sanitary products in the bathrooms that are there, having proper dressing rooms, having quality coaching. I think it is improving for sure.
You mentioned earlier about how sometimes health and well-being don't necessarily go with high performance to a lot of people or to a lot of coaches. And it's something I find really interesting, even from the boxing background. You think about the point of the sport for a lot of people is brain cells for wins, therefore for money. Do you think it's an issue that most coaches, athletes, teams will run into, that if the athlete is willing, they'll probably sacrifice their health, their well-being, even their mental health, just to get their performance peaked or to get them performing as best as possible, as opposed to actually thinking about maybe the kind of life they're going to have after sport?
Yeah, I think the responsibility, if you're looking at underage sports, and I'm in a senior team, but there are some underage players. If you're looking at underage athletes, the responsibility is solely on the coach. You can't expect the underage athlete to make maybe the most informed decisions around their longevity or their health when they retire. So I think it's super, super important that the coach takes that responsibility very seriously and looks at their load. For me as well, it's definitely trying to look at what they're doing outside of the sport as well. And if they're in a TY program, or if they're working with an international team, it's super important for us all to communicate around that and try to make sure that we're all holding the best interest of the athlete at the forefront of absolutely everything that we do, and that we're working together to ensure that. And I think working with senior athletes, it's hard because they are adults, they can make their own decisions. But for me, it's definitely just about educating them that the stereotype of I have to suffer in order to gain, or I have to mentally suffer, or I have to be in a really dark place in order to get my peak performance, it's quite outdated now. And there are so many tools, just like strength and conditioning. You can train your quads, your shoulders, your biceps, your core to get stronger and fitter and healthier. You can run more to get fitter. You can do more technical work to get better as a footballer. You can also go to a sports psychologist and develop your mental strength, your mental capacity, your resilience, your clutch state. You can look at your flow state. There's so many things that you can do, but it's only very, very recently been involved in high performance sports over the last couple of years. So for me, there's a responsibility on the coach for sure, and then there's a self-responsibility on senior athletes to just be educated, be open. They are adults, they can make their own decisions for sure at the end of the day, but I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I didn't at least try and educate and try to empower them. Again, going back to your very first question, try to empower them to make their own decisions, try to allow them to get a hold of their own self-development and try to make informed decisions.
Do you feel like, because it can be difficult sometimes, because you have these athletes who have this really specific goal and they're willing to give absolutely everything for, and you know, you are in a way as a coach encouraging them and providing them the best opportunity to do it, but sometimes you may feel like you have to tie a rope around them and pull them back a little bit. Is that something you find difficult and a conflict in your head, because you know that they're strongly pushing for this high level goal that they have, whether it's the footballers, motorsport is something we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but sometimes they need to be pulled back and saved from themselves.
Yeah, it's just about judging the athlete and judging the situation. I think in general, my principles are quite similar. I admire athletes that want to have this drive and have this motivation and this will to just succeed at any cost. And I think when you're looking at high performers, most of them are going to be like that. They'll sacrifice anything in order to reach pinnacle of success. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's more so just educating them that that doesn't have to be the way. There are other options where your mental health doesn't have to suffer in order for you to perform at your peak. A big thing as well around women in general in sport, not just football, as well as body image issues and trying to look a certain way, but looking a certain way and performing a certain way are sometimes contradictory as well. So for my master's dissertation, my master's thesis, I'm kind of going down that avenue around the prevalence of body image issues within the league or within sports as a whole for women. And I think there's so much that athletes are willing to sacrifice in order to perform. And I just don't think they realize that they don't have to do that. There are other routes and there are other options that they can go down in order to reach the pinnacle of their own potential. But again, I don't think it's mainstream. I think there's very much a stereotype around suffering leads to this. And for sure, you do have to sacrifice time. You have to sacrifice social time. You have to sacrifice a lot. You have to push yourself hard in training. You have to go to places that are difficult for sure. But I think a more holistic approach where you're looking at all aspects and trying to just find what works for you individually will be much more successful long term.
I want to actually go back just for a second to an Instagram story I saw from you. This is ages ago, and I don't know why it's popped into my head now, but you had a group of footballers that were obviously traveling through time zones, and they were all wearing their sunglasses in the airport in order to help with their circadian rhythm. And it's something I found really interesting. Can you just enlighten me on that a little bit? Because I presume they got plenty of weird looks when they went through the airport.
Yeah, they did get plenty of weird looks. That was a couple of years ago now. I think it was in preparation.
I don't know why I remember that. It just came into my head.
I think it was preparation for the World Cup. So at the time, we would have had 3 players that were over traveling to America. They were playing the USA twice over a number of days, and they were going to, I think it was St. Louis and then somewhere else. I can't remember in the States, but they were traveling a bit as well. And they were back on maybe the Thursday, and then we had a game on the Saturday. So I was going, okay, they're going to be all over the place. How can we try and manage this a little bit more? So circadian rhythm generally is just your 24-hour sleep cycle of being awake or being asleep. And then you look at your serotonin, which is the chemical that wakes you up in the morning, then your melatonin that puts you to sleep at night. So when you try and manipulate light, caffeine, around those things, it makes a big difference. So I was basically just trying to get them back on Irish time as quick as possible. So when they finished their last game, I was like, okay, go to bed now. So try and get back on Irish time. So when they were in the airports, they were linking in with the medical team as well. So they were able to get melatonin to sleep on the flight. But light is one of the biggest factors, as well as caffeine, that will impact their circadian rhythms. So I just wear sunglasses in the airports, and it might seem mad, but for me it was quite logical, like, because they obviously couldn't hide from the bright lights of being in the airports or being outside. So I'm pretty sure the rest of the Irish team kind of copped on as well and did the same. But yeah, it's for me, performance is just about trying to think maybe outside the box sometimes as well. And although for me that was quite practical and quite normal, everyone thought that was a bit mad, like, but it was just controlling a layer of performance. So when they got back to Ireland, they were probably more than likely to be back on Irish time. They'd sleep better, they'd be able to get up the next morning, and they'd be less fatigued when we were traveling to Galway on the Saturday. So yeah, it was quite simple for me, quite a practical solution.
Do you feel like it's a level of detail that most coaches in your scenario or situation wouldn't have thought of, wouldn't have suggested anything? They would just say, well, they're going to the airport, I can't control that. But you turned something they couldn't control into something they could control. Is that a little bit of detail you think probably most people in your scenario wouldn't have thought of?
I don't know, to be honest, is the answer. I think I probably am a bit weird in how I think, and probably do think outside the box a good bit, but it's evidence informed. Like, and I think I originally started learning about circadian rhythm from Max Verstappen's performance coach or former performance coach, and he was just putting up some tips around controlling your caffeine and light exposure. So I was like, well, it just makes sense to put sunglasses on if you're trying to get away from light, because they couldn't walk through the airport with their eyes closed. So I don't know if it's very unique. It's definitely something that's been done by performance coaches for sure. And yeah, I think it's, if there's something that you can control, I'm probably a bit of a problem solver as well. So if you can't control everything, that's fine, but just what are the things that you can control? And for me, if I was an athlete and I knew I was ticking all my boxes of controllables, I'd be much more comfortable and would feel much more at ease then going into the game, because I would have known I've done everything I possibly could have. And then with regards to the uncontrollables, stressing about them is just unhelpful. And although it does take a huge amount of practice in order to get to that stage, I feel like it's just much easier to focus on the things you can control, and you're much less stressed about them then.
You mentioned there a second ago about Max Verstappen. A really interesting coaching avenue for you was working with a high level motorist, which was James Rowe. How did you find that whole experience, and how do you find it? It's a really different sport that I presume is a lot of mental preparation and a very different style of training than perhaps working with footballers, boxers, and any other athletes you've worked with previously.
Yeah, so working with James has been incredible. James is based in the States, and he comes home a little bit, and there's been blocks of training that he's been here in Unit 3 for. And yeah, he's a very unique athlete. He's an incredible character. I just love actually being around him. Really charismatic and extremely professional, and a really, really smart businessman, as well as a very talented driver. And he works extremely hard as well. So he's a local guy, and just basically has gotten to where he's gotten to from pure will, hard work, sacrifice, commitments, and just bullheadedness in some ways. But working with him was excellent because it was completely different, completely out of my comfort zone, even in terms of training. Like, if you're a footballer, how many hours a week do you spend playing football? Like, it's quite a lot. Whereas if you're a race car driver, you very rarely get into the car to practice because it's so expensive. So they're using like simulators and stuff as well. So that just blew my mind. And then the prep that you do around that then is super important. So traditionally, the idea of a motor sports driver or a racing car driver is that they have quite an unhealthy life. Like, I know previously they'd be like smoking in the pits, and like there wouldn't be a huge layer of conditioning or an emphasis on their gym work or their fitness levels, whereas the more modern approach is super important. Of course it is, because their concentration levels is very important. I had the opportunity as well to go over to a gym called PitFit that are in Indianapolis. And they work with James full time, and they work with a lot of racing drivers that are within that industry, and their level of detail is just incredible. I learned so much from them in terms of reaction. They had loads of little gadgets, and they gave me some vector balls to bring home that were kind of balls that light up differently, and you can do loads of drills with them that I use with the footballers now, especially the goalkeepers. They did a lot of neck based work as well, neck training, which we've brought into Unit 3 now, and I also bring in with the footballers too, especially the centre halves that be heading the ball an awful lot. So just an incredibly cool experience. Got to travel to Monza with him, where he was competing in Lamborghinis, and it was kind of it was out of my comfort zone for sure, but it kind of like, I had this idea that you kind of have to know the sport to work in the sport, but you actually don't really. Like, you just need to know the demands of the sport. And for him, he's in a racing suit where an engine is behind his head, so it's really hot environment. He has to concentrate really hard for a lot of laps. He has to stay in the one position for a huge amount of time as well. So it's just knowing the demands of that sport instead of knowing the ins and outs. You don't need to know tactically or technically, or I don't know anything about cars. Like, I know cars aren't an interest of mine, but his performance as an athlete is. So that was really cool to kind of understand that, and I'm very grateful to James and the opportunities that experience has brought me.
When going into something like that, do you feel a level, because it's so new and so different, do you feel a level of imposter syndrome, like you shouldn't really be here, you don't really understand it that much?
Yeah, I think that's normal, isn't it? Like, it's there's a lack of comfort, and I think football is definitely my comfort zone because I know the sport. So going into I walked into the garage in Monza, and I was just like the most famous, one of the most famous racetracks ever, and I was just standing there with loads of really educated engineers and mechanics, and I actually met is she an engineer or a mechanic? I'm not an engineer, I think. Emer, that was from Nace, and like, it was the maddest experience ever. So yeah, there's definitely an element of what am I doing here, like, but you're just there to do a specific job, and your specific job is to make sure that the athlete is ready to perform, make sure they're warmed up to get into the car, make sure that they're in the best place that they can, they're fueled. Like, you're just a runner really, and you're trying to just look after your specific role, and that I realized doesn't really have anything to do with the car. Like, that's on the mechanics and the engineers. So for sure there was an element of, oh Jesus, I hope I'm not going to get in the way here, like, or I don't know what if they ask me this or what if they ask me that. But you're just there to plug the gap that's your role entails, and that was a great learning experience for me, because once you know the demands of the sport again, and the demands that are going to be placed onto the athlete, then you don't really need to know anything else.
You mentioned the neck training as well, which is a real fascinating one, because it's a real old school boxing style of training. You see old videos of Mike Tyson rolling around on the floor, putting all sorts of weight on his head, and it's shown reduced in studies shown reduced rates of concussion and damage from punches and footballers heading the ball. Can you just talk to me a little bit about that? And it's, again, probably something that I presume if you tell footballers we're going to start getting you to roll on your neck and train your neck, they probably look at you like you're a little bit strange, but it's clearly something that works.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely something that I was very educated on, or not very educated on, but learned a lot about when I started working with James, because it's a huge aspect of their sport because of the G-force when they're in the car. So it just made sense to me that if they had stronger necks as athletes, even as say footballers, for example, that it would help when they're headering the ball. And I looked at the most common injuries within the League of Ireland at the time, and concussion was number 4 or something. So I was like, it just makes sense to add in a bit of neck work. Now, if I started getting them to roll on their necks, they just tell me where to go. So it's very simple things, just isometric holds where they're trying to just engage their neck muscles. And we haven't progressed into like mad stuff, because it's a very, very small percentage again of, it's probably 1% of what we need to do in the gym. But I've incorporated it into the prehab for maybe 2-3 seasons now, and it has helped for sure. Like, we, touch wood, haven't had many concussions or anything, but yeah, when something just makes sense and the evidence backs it up, I think it's super important to try to incorporate it into your training. And maybe it's one of those mad things again that not many strength and conditioning coaches for football would look at incorporating, but it's not going to hurt, and it's definitely going to help. So we've tried it and it's been quite successful. Yeah.
Is there any other techniques or methods, especially I'm thinking with the motorsport, because it's such an unknown, the training, the strength and conditioning for motorsport is so unknown, that was really surprising to you, or that if you go and explain to other people, they're really surprised about, you know, why you do these certain things? Is there anything that's kind of stands out to you as that just, it didn't make sense before, but now it does?
There was a couple of things that I just maybe hadn't thought of. They made sense then when I was being educated on them. I think it is actually kind of a weight-based sport as well, so they do have to weigh a certain amount getting into the car, or they're encouraged to weigh a certain amount, because if you're heavier, obviously the car will go a little bit slower, and those milliseconds matter when you're racing at the top level. So yeah, so I actually didn't even think about weight when I started working with James, and that he had to stay within a certain weight, or had to go up or had to drop at different phases of the season. So that was one of them. I think as well, what I mentioned earlier, the fact that they have very limited time actually in the cars, was something that just blew my mind. Because when you want to get better at football, you get out on the green with a football, like, and you get your reps in, whereas that's not the case in high performance motor racing or at any level. And I think the third thing as well was the heat that they have to be able to withstand when they're in the cars is ridiculous. Like, and they have they've like their fire protection suits on, they've their overalls, they have a big helmet on, and the engine in the Lamborghinis James was in was right behind his head. So the heat that he had to put up with which is why they do a lot of sauna sessions and stuff as well, and try to train in and out of the sauna. So yeah, I find that stuff just so interesting though, and learning about different sports, again, related to the athlete, not necessarily related to the car or whatever the tools are. It's just something that's so interesting as a performance coach, or someone who's trying to get an athlete into their peak performance state in order to perform. So it wasn't anything really mad, but just things I hadn't thought about.
You're currently studying a master's in applied sport and exercise psychology. As someone who's already very well educated and already has a good build up of athletes kind of under your wing, Why did you feel the need to go and take another step with your education? Because one, it's a lot of time that is probably of the essence with you, and also it's a cost as well.
Yeah. Um, Sports psychology, and maybe linking back to your earlier question around trying to collaborate performance and health. Um, that's probably kind of inspired me or made me realize, oh, I actually really like this. Like, I actually really like to get to know the athlete and get to know the human. And I've always been very drawn to psychology in general and human behavior in and outside of sports too. So it's something I've always thought about. I absolutely love strength and conditioning, but I feel like my best work or the most impact I have is when I'm working with the human and I'm trying to help them with their self-talk or their body language, or trying to perform under pressure, or trying to educate them on tiny things related to psychology. And again, I'm just a student in this, but from just having a general interest in it, it's really kind of naturally progressed into my practice as a coach. So I just have thought about it for years, and I was kind of like, what's the harm in this? Like, and for sure there's negatives and there's time pressure, and it's difficult to incorporate when you're working full time as well. But I'm very blessed to be in a position where my employers, both Shamrock Rovers and Unit 3 here, are very supportive of it and have allowed me the time to go to my residential weeks, or when I'm doing exams, or do whatever I need to try and pass basically. But yeah, I adore it. If I actually could do a full-time, it's a part-time course. It's a full-time course delivered in a part-time capacity, so you do a lot of the learning on your own, but I just love it. Like, it's the lecturers that we have are practitioners within sports as well. So Dr. Ciara Losty, Kevin McMenamin, who was a Dublin player as well, and was very successful with them. And because they're actual practitioners working within high performance sports with Olympic teams as well, I just listen to them all day. And I think that really reaffirmed when I went in, and I was like, okay, yeah, I'm supposed to be here, and this is what I really want to do. And I would love to transition into a full-time sports psychologist or sports psychology consultant eventually. And I definitely want to try and veer down that route, because I feel like it's very fulfilling for me, but it's also probably somewhere that I could excel and I could really help a lot of people.
Yeah, it's actually something I was going to ask. Do you see yourself, like, your future one day maybe being less so pitch side or on the gym floor, and more so sitting down and psychologically analyzing athletes and talking to them about, issues they may be having with performance and stuff like that? Is that where you see your future a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's such an under kind of developed industry in some ways in Ireland. Maybe it's just the sport that I'm in. And there are incredible practitioners in our country as well. Vanessa McCann has been a really good mentor for me. She was working with Shelburne ladies last year. She's working with DLR 19s this year as well. And she's had great experience, and she's been a really good help for me throughout my studies too. I reached out to David McHugh, who's over in Washington Spirit, also who's from Athlone in the Midlands, and he has been really helpful too. So I think that there's a very small cohort in Ireland, and I think there's probably a million strength and conditioning coaches, and there's probably way few sports psychology consultants or mental performance coaches. So I think it's undersaturated, and it's somewhere that there's definitely a gap to enter into. And I really hope and I really believe that it will progress an awful lot, and it'll become the norm in sports. Just like there's always an S&C, there should always be a sports psych as well, especially in high performance sports. I think it's crucial. So yeah, it's definitely somewhere that I'd like to venture into more.
And then extending on from your education, do you often find yourself kind of trying to, and I'm sure you do because of what you've already said, but trying to challenge traditional coaching methods that may have been around for a long time? And to you and I, who do a lot of research and a lot of actual hours on the floor, you mentioned you're more of a practitioner than a researcher, that these methods might not make sense. You might have your own that seem unusual, but they make sense to you, and you're almost trying to challenge the old school methods of coaching.
Yeah, I challenge everything in a good way, and I challenge myself and my own methods an awful lot as well. I think that an evidence-based approach is best practice, and it's for sure the approach that I take regularly. I think because research is limited at the moment in female athletes, female health specifically, there is room to maybe explore, not completely go against the evidence that's there, because it's super important and I definitely follow it. But I think just the practicalities of it sometimes can be tweaked. And I think that's based on the individualism the athletes, the individualism of the program that you're in, the coaching staff, the league that you're playing in, the sport that you're playing in. So yeah, for sure, I challenge everything all the time in a really positive way. And I like when Evan, say for example, who's my brother, but he's also my assistant coach in Shamrock Rovers and here in the gym, and he's always like, but why would you do that, and would you not try this, and would you not do, and it's brilliant because it just makes me better, and it means that the service that's been provided to the athletes, whether it's here or whether it's within football, is enhanced, and they're getting the best version of whatever we've come up with. So yeah, I would try different things. We incorporated like a little pressure test with our testing at the start of pre-season as well, which is very unique and probably a bit different for a strength and conditioning coach to do as well. But we're always trying to just, anything that kind of makes sense and that you can relate back to theory in some ways is super important, I feel. And I feel like I'm probably an unacademic researcher, maybe, like in the field, and trying to take the research that's there and put my own spin in it and just see what works. And sometimes things don't work, and that's fine, but you just have to try them, stick with the principles that are there, and make sure you're not adding harm, cause, or stress to the athletes. And if you think it's going to enhance performance, enhance their education, or allow them to be a bit more self-sufficient, then it's definitely worth it.
What you mentioned there about, almost it seems like you're not afraid for a method to be wrong, and it's a real interesting outlook. I think like a real way to judge someone's intelligence or how they look at things is their ability to say, I don't know, or I don't really understand, but I'm going to try it and we'll get an answer. Is that something you feel that will propel you on to be a better coach than you are today? The fact that you're willing to try things, maybe get it wrong, but you'll learn from it? Yeah,
I think humility is hopefully one of my strengths, but I think some people can see it as a weakness maybe as well. And I think for sure, I'm a female in quite a male dominated space, and I feel humility is a really good strength, but you absolutely have to own what you're doing as well. And for the environments that I'm in now, I shouldn't say blessed because it should just be normal, but I'm very blessed and very grateful to be in very open, inclusive environments that gender isn't even an issue, and it never would be. But I have been in previous environments where that wasn't the case. So for me, humility and owning your mistakes and looking for solutions and asking for feedback is something that traditionally everyone should do. But sometimes it could actually go against you if you're looking at environments where you're probably down in the pecking order anyway.
Yeah, do you feel like it's because I feel like that so many people who coach or work with athletes, normal people, they're almost afraid to be wrong. They're almost afraid to ask questions because of how it'll make them look, and I don't need to ask that. I know the answer, but the best thing to do is always to ask the question or to try and get it wrong rather than just pretending you know it and you actually don't.
Yeah, for sure. It's an approach that's just logical for me. It's going to make me better as a coach, or it's going to improve the performance of the team, or it's going to enhance the experience of the athletes, or whatever it is. So for me, it's a no-brainer to try and question your own methods, try and ask for opinions from other practitioners that are there, try and ask feedback from the athletes and from the players that are there too. So for me, it makes sense, and it means that everyone wins then. So it's a win for the athletes, it's a win for you, you're learning, you're growing, and it's a win for the overall program that you're trying to succeed in.
I find it really interesting as well. You mentioned the male dominated space. So there's obviously quite a lot of female personal trainers and online coaches, but I find that as you go to training athletes, the percentage gets a little bit smaller, and I'm sure 8, 9, 10 years ago it was definitely a lot smaller. Is that something that ever mentally held you back, gave you a little bit of fear in becoming what you wanted to?
Fear, I don't think so, because I've just been maybe naturally fallen into these environments, and it's not something that I've thought of going into these environments, but I've gone into some environments and then gone, oh, okay, this is actually an issue, I have to be more aware of this. Like, and again, where I'm at now is an incredibly inclusive space, both the Shamrock Rovers especially. Again, it should be normal practice, but that's not even an issue within that club there. They're exceptionally open, inclusive, and very supportive, and I feel very valued there. Previous environments, for sure, my gender has meant my words meant less, or that my education was deemed less than, or things were questioned based around what I felt was my gender, or misogynistic comments. Or I've definitely experienced that, and maybe I experience less of it because I'm in a women's sports. I'm in women's sports. Maybe if I was coaching a men's team, it might be a little bit different. I don't know. But I think if you're looking at barriers to female coaches coming into these roles, I think it would be ignorant to not acknowledge them. Although where I'm at now, and I don't think it's the norm, to be honest, at the moment, for where we're at and for hopefully the progression of society and the progression of the league as a whole, I don't think it's as prevalent. But I think it's for sure there in some spaces, and I think it might be a barrier for maybe some women coming into high performance sports. But for me, I didn't have a fear. I would just have more of an awareness coming into certain environments. But again, where I'm at the moment, I'm very valued, I feel, and I feel very grateful for that.
You like to read books, don't you?
I do.
What is a quote or a statement that you've read from any book, any time, that you feel you still use and live by on a regular basis now?
My favorite coach ever, I've read a lot of books, this is very hard. My favorite coach ever is Coach John Wooden, the legendary basketball coach, and his book, I feel his method of coaching probably resonates with me a bit more, and he'd be quite human based as well as trying to progress athletic performance. And he has, have you read his book?
No, not
No,
yet.
it's brilliant. I'll give it to you.
Yeah.
And he said winning isn't the point, wanting to win is the point. And I feel like that for me is just something that stuck with me always, because it really sums up everything that you're trying to impart around controllables, work ethic, trying to do your best, giving whatever your best is every day that you're there, and trying to, I feel like sometimes the more you try to control something, the less control you have over it. So focusing on, like, say if you're going into a game and you're like, I want to win, I need to win, I want to win, I have to win, like, you're just stepping further and further away from that. Whereas if you break that down into process orientated goals and you're going, okay, what's the best chance of me winning? It's going to sleep on time, it's eating good nutrition, it's training really hard, it's getting out of my comfort zone, it's working on my psychology, it's working on my self-talk, my body language, my physical prep, my timings of food before games, my recovery after games. If you do all of these things accurately, supporting my teammates, doing my job on the pitch, simplifying everything, you're going to have a higher probability of succeeding, and you're going to have a higher probability of winning. So instead of just focusing on wanting to win is the point, instead of just I need to win. So I love John Wooden. I think he's excellent, and I think that quote summarizes a lot of maybe the philosophies that I've tried to impart in my own method of coaching.
Do you have a moment in your head, so some people call it their Everest moment, whether it be for you coaching a team to a certain stage, or an individual athlete, or even a personal goal that you have, that's just something you really want to achieve in life, something when you were 12, 15 that you decided, you know what, one day I'll get there?
Do you know what, when I was younger, I never really had like, do you know, if you're like, I want to be a pro football player, I want to be a pro boxer, or I want to be a firewoman, or whatever it is, like I never actually really have memories of having those immense dreams or desires when I was younger. I think I naturally kind of just fell into coaching and fell into this career, and I very much believe in the universe, and I believe that I have a hand on my shoulder pushing me in the right directions and pushing me through the correct doors. So previously, no. Right now, I want to be a sports psychologist. I want to be a sports psychology consultant, and I want to work with athletes, and I want to help them in an area that's probably a bit underdeveloped, especially in this country. And I want to learn from the best in the industry. So for me, if you could say in 5 years time, 10 years time, whatever it is, that I'd be a full-time sports psychologist working with athletes, I would take your hand. I'd bite your hands off. And I think I will get there for sure. I think there's, especially when you go into actually something like sports psychology, my undergrad degree isn't in psychology. So my master's is actually only the starting point. I have to do my master's, and then if I want to get accreditation, I have to do 1,600 hours within a high performance setting. And then at that, I can't call myself a psychologist unless I go back and do an undergrad in psychology. So there's a lot of hoops to jump through, which is actually correct, I believe, because it's, anyone can call themselves a psychologist, and are they educated? I don't know, but this is the start of this journey for me, and it's something that I feel is going to take a lot of time, but it's the journey at the moment, so I'm really enjoying, bar the stress of time pressure and exams and all of that nice stuff. But yeah, if I could be practicing sports psychology and having a big impact on the industry in Ireland or abroad, I'd love that.
I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit now, because it's your last question. What are 3 things an individual can be guaranteed when they work with Orlaith White?
Authenticity, I think. I think I'm quite real. Professionalism in terms of confidentiality, and just trying to deliver professional service, and then education. So try to educate as much as I can, and honestly wants them to not need me anymore, which is not very good business wise. But I feel like if you have that desire to allow the athlete to become themselves, become self-sufficient, they need to check in every now and then no problem at all. But if they have those tools to succeed, I feel like that's the pinnacle.
Orla, thank you so much for joining me today. And for those of you watching and listening, if you don't know Orlaith White, make sure you get to know her.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks very much.